Alright guys, today I'm going to talk to you about classroom management. And I know you've been beaten over the head with tips for classroom management, but today I'm going to talk more specifically about managing the differentiated classroom. And things start to get a little hairy when we talk about differentiating and having different groups doing different things, and teacher meeting with one group while some kids are independently working, and it can get difficult. So I read How to Differentiate Instruction in Mixed Ability Classrooms by Tomlinson, and I'm using mainly Chapter 6 as my source for this presentation. So I guess the kind of guiding question that I'd like to discuss today is what keeps us from really differentiating? Well, there's an album by a band called Zaya, which I don't necessarily recommend if you're not into crazy heavy metal, but the title is "The Fear Is What Keeps Us Here," and I thought that title really fit with this idea of us being afraid sometimes of changing things up. The question is why? Well, differentiating is a lot of work. Okay, so maybe some of us are afraid of putting in that extra work because we already do so much. And some of us are just stuck in our comfort zones, and it's really easy for that to happen. And I don't think any of us are immune to getting in that rut of the comfort zone. But truth be told, we have to get over those things. And I don't have any good strategies to give you right now. Maybe one day. But today, we're going to talk about the fear of a classroom going crazy and fear of not knowing how to manage that differentiated classroom. But as the meme shows us, well, what if I told you that students can be self-managers? Now, we say that a lot, but do we truly believe it? I do. I think that students just need a bit of direction on our part, but once we give them that direction, once we model, once we practice, I think that students truly can be self-managers like the way that we need them to be in a differentiated classroom. So what I've done is I've taken the top 6 strategies that I've found in chapter 6 of the book, and I've kind of put them out here to discuss with you today. The top 6 strategies for managing differentiation, and I'm going to kind of put my spin on it and tell you how I go about them in my classroom. We're going to start with managing time frames. You're going to have students that will handle certain activities for longer periods of time than others. Typically what you'll have is you'll have your advanced readers who will get really involved in a book or really involved in a particular subject, and they're going to stick with something a lot longer than your student who's reading 2 grade levels behind, right? And they're going to need less direction too. So what you're going to find is that some of your maybe middle to middle ground learners or your struggling learners, they need to switch out activities more often, whereas some of your more advanced learners, you're doing them a disservice if you're constantly switching them to something different. Maybe they need something they can take deeper. And here is it actually happening in my classroom. Here's one of my groups that I see on a regular basis in guided reading. And they're doing word work, and these lessons usually last anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes. And meanwhile, we have another group working on iPads. This is another group that sees me almost daily, and they're typically swapping out with this group here at about halfway through the class. I try not to keep them working independently for too long because many of them will end up getting lost. They need more direction than that. On the other hand, I have a group of advanced readers who if you see them there, they're digging through newspapers looking for unfamiliar words and doing some different kinds of word work activity with those words that they find on their own. They're good to work through probably 45 minutes independently, and they're going to get something out of this activity. Do they need me to watch periodically? Sure. Do they need a bit of interaction here and there for me to kind of guide them or push them further? Sure. But they don't necessarily need to switch things up as often as my other 2 groups. And of course, when you have students working on different time frames and you have people working independently while you're dealing with groups, there's going to be some dead time. The question is, how do we handle that? Well, you can start with independent reading. And this is good for some, but just telling a kid to pull out a book when they're finished, and eventually you're asking for problems, because what you have are those kids who have a book out and they're staring off, and the next thing you know, they're playing with their neighbor, and that's not useful. Um, we can take it a step further, and we can go with reading response in a reading class. And so if your students have a journal that they go to, and they take notes, or they can respond to what they're reading, that gives them kind of a second option to use as they wait to move on. And if they're responding to text, they are thinking critically and they're doing something useful. We have a big focus on academic vocabulary in my class right now, so word work, you can mix some of that in, and you have some pre-made activities. We use inverted vocabulary pyramids and things like that you can have waiting for them. They need to be pre-made though, so there again, you have some work that you need to do. And finally, what I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about are the anchor activities. These are your fallback plans. These are self-directed. That's all about expectations. These are things that your students know are there, they know what to do with them, and they are useful activities. Bottom line, you start small and you take it a step at a time. Okay, you're not all of a sudden going to get awesome at curing dead time in your classroom, but start small and work your way up. That's all you can really realistically expect. As far as anchor activity is concerned, I call them go-to activities in my classroom. And here's what it looks like in my class. I have a cubby set up, each one labeled with a different depth and complexity icon. Now I've made graphic organizers, you can see if you look closely, to go with each icon. And they're pretty open-ended, but they provide enough direction to where a reader who has used them before or seen them used can go in and pick one of these and use it during their independent reading time. Now, most of these I have gone through and we've used in class at some point, so they've been, for the most part, they've been modeled for the students. If they haven't, they're pretty self-explanatory. But the way this works in my class is students, when they have independent reading time, this can be during dead time or when I assign them independent reading time, they know that they're allowed to read, and then they're allowed to go to the go-to cubby and grab a graphic organizer and fill it out based on what they're reading. And they all, each one requires them to think critically. It's good. It's not busy work. And once they are done with their go-to activity, they know that step 3, they're allowed to go grab an iPad if one's available, or sit at an empty computer, and they can sign on to KidBlog. And here is where they respond to their text, share with the rest of the class what they're reading, give a bit of a summary of what they read, and then they go in and they explain what activity they did from the go-to activities. And once they finish that, they're allowed to go comment on other people's blogs and kind of discuss reading. And honestly, they love it. They really do. And this is something I've been doing for a little while now, and it's working. It took a few classes of, kind of getting everybody on the same page, but it's definitely working. Our next strategy is to provide instructions. When you are having different groups work on different things on different levels, especially when you're meeting with or trying to meet with a group that needs extra help, what you're going to find is that other students in other groups are going to want to ask you lots of questions. They will get lost. So it's your duty to make sure that they kind of know what's going on before you get started with your groups. And one good way to do that is to use task cards. Cards that show them exactly what they're supposed to do. Now, the problem with task cards sometimes is we as teachers like to get carried away and give all these instructions, and next thing you know, kids feel like this. They can't understand what in the world you have just written for them. So when we're writing instructions, it's crucial that they don't feel like you feel if you were sitting in this classroom right here. Your task cards need to be clearly worded, and they need to get right to the point. There shouldn't be any question about what they mean. There shouldn't be extraneous information that they don't need. Okay? Good ways to go about this are to maybe make numbered lists or use a flow map like you see here on the screen. Something that gets right to the point. The next strategy deals with students getting stuck. You know it's going to happen, and some students get stuck more often than others. You might be wondering, what can I do about that? Or can I do anything about it? Well, in many cases you can. And you can by starting to teach your students how to be problem solvers, how to be self-managers, how to, or what strategies can they use to try and figure out where to go next? Can they skip a problem and move on? Or can they go and ask someone else? And that's where the expert of the day comes in. Choose a student who knows what's going on, a student who thoroughly understands the instructions and is on top of things, and make them your go-to person in class for kids to ask questions when they're stuck. Now, of course, this is when you are busy working with other students, and your expert of the day isn't going to be able to field all the questions. Eventually, or in some cases, you're going to have to get involved. And you're also going to want to switch up who's the expert of the day so you don't end up with a teacher's pet scenario or interfering with your expert of the day's learning. Noise. Oh. Sometimes I go home with headaches, let's be honest, you too probably. And why? Because you have 25, 30, however many kids you have in a little room, all collaborating, working together, and they're noisy. And you know what? And if you're having trouble with your classroom management, maybe they're not collaborating, maybe they're just messing around. It's easy to have that happen when you're trying to differentiate your classroom. But let's face it, you're not going to sit around all day quietly, and neither are they. It's unrealistic to expect that, and I'm not going to insult you by acting like you don't know that, but sometimes we need to be reminded. These kids are sitting in class all day with attention spans that aren't as long as ours, which ours are short too. So the question is, how do you handle that noise? How do you get that ideal level of noise? And you have to find a happy medium. You don't want there to be so much noise that you can't hear yourself think, that you can't hear your readers in guided reading to you. At the same time, they can't be so quiet that they can't collaborate with one another. So you really have to figure that out. One way we do that is by teaching our students to kind of monitor their noise levels. We use thumbs up, thumbs sideways, thumbs down in my class, and where I'll stop students and say, where are we at? And they'll show me on their thumbs. And it seems like that kind of little physical activity, and they see where the thumbs are, often helps kind of jog their memory as to, oh yeah, we need to remember to get thumbs up, because otherwise we're interfering with learning. We also do level 0, level 1, level 2, level 3. I don't know if there's level 3 actually, but level 0 means no talking. Level 1 means regular voices. We use level 1/2, which is almost like whispering. I shouldn't be able to hear what they're saying when I'm across the room, but I know that they're talking. And that usually gives a nice kind of buzz over the classroom, but not chaos over the classroom. Assignments. This can be a sticking point. It has been in my class many times. This year I've kind of changed things up a little bit. First of all, during the week, students now know, and this is something that we go over and over and over. We physically place the papers there. We talk about it. I remind them on a daily basis. Still get some questions, but that's okay. It's students are starting to self-manage how they're turning in their assignments more, and it's really helping my differentiated class go better. So first of all, throughout the week, students now know all of the work they do in their groups they keep in the front pocket of their reading folder. They don't have to ask me if they turn it in. Do we turn this in? Do we turn this in? Because the answer is no. They're going to put it in the front pocket of their red reading folder, and at the end of the week, we staple it all together, and then they turn it in. And that gives me an idea of what what they've done throughout the week. In fact, they're now keeping a page on throughout the week that they staple on top that says keeping track of our weekly work, and they go through and they kind of log what they've done, what they've learned, and what they still need to finish. As far as independent assignments or assessments, things of that nature, we have a designated turn-in basket. I used to have different shelves where people would put different papers, but that would pile up, get messed up. This year I've gone to one single milk crate with a folder labeled for each class. They know period 1 goes in the number 1 folder, period 2 goes in the period 2 folder. If it's later makeup work, there's a folder for that as well. So far, that's the best system I have found since I've been teaching, and it's working well for me. I'm not the most organized guy paper-wise, and so this is working out for me well. So bottom line, you need a model for them. You need to set expectations for knowing when to turn in and when not to. And once you set those expectations, that cuts down on, again, the questions. And if you can cut down on the questions that are not necessary, that don't involve the thinking that you want them doing as learners, then you are one step closer to successfully managing your classroom. And lastly, you want them to know what to move on to, which we kind of covered with the anchor activities. So there are times when it's time to go and you need to move on, and some kids simply aren't going to finish. And we all know, we all have those students, right? The question is, how do you handle that? Because that gets frustrating, especially when everyone is working on different work. What do you do? What do you do with those kids that don't finish? Well, first of all, you can start by giving them a heads up. Maybe it's the class before, maybe it's 15 minutes before, whatever the case is. You're trying to keep them on track and setting, every so often checking in to make sure that they have a time frame in mind. Perhaps you'll let them finish at home, although for some students you don't want them to have more work at home. You might consider making, if the assignment is something you deem important, making it an alternate homework assignment, something they can swap out for a different homework assignment. Of course, you don't, you don't want every assignment to go home, because there are some things that you won't necessarily want the parents to help their students with, or maybe there are some students who if it goes home, it's probably not coming back. So that's not always the best answer. Sometimes it is. You also might consider extending time a little bit and letting the rest of the students who are finished go back to the anchor activities, because if you have good anchor activities, you're not wasting time with that work. Okay? They can do those anchor activities and go through that process of independent reading and go to activities and blogging and all of that, and they'll get something out of that while the students who aren't finished get to finish up. And of course, like a good book, or just like a book, sometimes good readers do abandon books, and sometimes you may find that an assignment has to be abandoned. Only you can decide when that's appropriate. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. I can't tell you when that is. Finally, and I'm going to close out with this, guys. Bottom line is, you have to invest time in practicing your procedures. Okay? Your classroom isn't going to just suddenly run super smoothly and just magically be differentiated. It's not going to happen that way. This takes work. It takes setting expectations. It takes you spending time, and that time really is best spent up front. So this is not something that you're going to just unleash differentiation in your classroom and suddenly everybody's doing their own thing, and then later you're going to teach them what they're supposed to be doing. It doesn't work that way. You need to not be afraid up front to spend time and teach many lessons on classroom or on management, on procedures. Don't be afraid of pushing aside the curriculum a little bit to do that too, because that time that you spend up front is worth it, and you will, that curriculum that you missed during those lessons, you'll earn that time back tenfold later. I'm just pulling that figure out of the air there, by the way. Don't quote me on that, but you will earn that time back. It's not time wasted. I can't stress that enough. It's not time wasted. Spend the time up front and periodically go back and revisit what you expect. Go through those procedures, and your students will become self-managers, and you will have a successfully managed differentiated classroom.